Okay, good evening, everybody, and welcome to the council public meeting for Tuesday, December the 10th. I'll call this meeting to order. Before we go further, though, I need to read the public hearing statement. If a person, public body, or specified person does not make oral submissions at a public meeting or make written submissions to the City of Richmond Hill in respect of a proposed official plan amendment or zoning bylaw amendment, the person, public body, or specified person is not entitled to appeal the decision of the City Council to the Ontario Land Tribunal and may be added as a party to the hearing of an appeal before the Ontario Land Tribunal unless, in the opinion of the tribunal, there are reasonable grounds to do so. The question I would ask is, what is a public body? Okay, that's fine. I learn something new every day. All right, so with that being said and that enlightenment happening, we'll call this meeting to order. I need a motion to adopt the agenda. Councillor Tree, all those in favor? Oh, sorry, seconder, Councillor Thompson, all those in favor? Opposed? That carries. Disclosures of pecuniary interest and general nature thereof. Okay, seeing none. So we have scheduled business. We have one item tonight. It is a request for comments on the comprehensive zoning bylaw project. And we are going to be getting a longer than usual presentation tonight by Christy Kilbourne from Millward and Associates Limited regarding the comprehensive zoning bylaw project. So is Christy in the, oh, hi, Christy. So welcome and thank you very much for being here, and the floor is yours for the next 20 minutes or so.
Excellent. Thanks so much. Good evening, Mayor West, members of council, members of the public, as well as staff. My name is Christy Kilbourne. I'm a senior planning associate with RE Millward and Associates, and I am presenting here tonight on behalf of the consulting team for the comprehensive zoning bylaw project. Members of our consulting team include Hurdle Planning, Friedman Urban Solutions, Code Studio, and Lura Consulting. And all members of our team are monitoring online this evening as well to listen in on comments and questions too. We have been working with staff since earlier this year on the city's comprehensive zoning bylaw. Let's just see here. So this evening, I'm going to provide a presentation covering a little bit of the project background for those who are new to the project, covering this particular phase of the zoning bylaw and the draft bylaw, which is available online, and that's phase 1A of the comprehensive zoning bylaw. And this phase addresses 4 areas. So the Yonge Street and Carville 16th Key Development Area, the Village Local Center, Newkirk Local Center, Oak Ridges Local Center, and then I'll talk a little bit about next steps and how the public can continue to be involved in this process as well. So for those, either this is a refresher or those new to the project, the objective of the comprehensive zoning bylaw project is threefold. And so it's to consolidate and simplify into a user-friendly, easy to administer, enforce, and understand document, to update so that it's reflective of current and emerging planning development practices and trends, and to modernize. So making sure that the end result is a fully accessible online bylaw and that it's in an interactive format as well. So this project is being completed in 4 separate phases. So the background research phase has been completed, and that involved a series of technical background reports as well. And those are available on the Zone Richmond Hill website for viewing. That phase also involved extensive public consultation too. And then the phase most recently completed was the strategic directions phase, where strategic directions were presented to council as well, which will guide the drafting of the new comprehensive zoning bylaw. And now we are currently in phase 3, which is actually the drafting of the new comprehensive zoning bylaw. And then the 4th phase after these phases of the bylaw will be the final approval and then appeals of if there are any, of the bylaw as well. So as I mentioned, the drafting of the bylaw is taking place in phases. So the current phase, as I mentioned, deals with the 1 key development area and the 3 local centers, as well as sets in a comprehensive zoning bylaw structure and provides associated parking and loading regulations for those areas. Future phases include phase 1B, which involves neighborhoods in the city, the Leslie Street institutional area, and of course, associated parking and loading. And then a future phase 2 will involve the remaining centers and corridors, including local development areas, regional mixed-use corridors, local mixed-use corridors, employment areas and employment corridors, greenway system, utility corridors, and associated parking and loading for those areas as well. And this phasing is aligned with the city's official plan review process as well. So leading up to this public meeting, there have been several consultation and engagement initiatives throughout the year, starting with the public open house, which was held earlier this year in June for the strategic directions reports. The strategic directions reports are available on the Zone Richmond Hill webpage as well, followed by, as I mentioned, the committee of the whole meeting in September on the strategic directions reports. And that also included a project engagement strategy as well for the project. And that received council endorsement in September as well. In October, we held a virtual open house, which was focused on gathering input on the drafting of phase 1A of the zoning bylaw, addressing the 1 key development area and then the 3 local centers as well. There has been engagement initiated with First Nations, including the Mississaugas of Scugog Island. And that will continue to be ongoing throughout the project, as well as ongoing communication and notifications to the interested parties list for the project. So at our October virtual open house meeting, we had a good attendance and we received comments and questions regarding these areas, including things like the impact of the recent provincial legislative changes, transition of uses and compatibility with adjacent low-density residential areas, the importance of preserving the village local center, the heritage character, desire to restrict drive-throughs in these areas, feasibility of applying regulations to govern contextually appropriate built form, as well as development and urban design standards. So things like building heights, angular planes, and setbacks. Also raised was the impacts of the future subway extension in the Yonge Street and Carville 16th Avenue KDA. Location of parking areas and site-specific exceptions and how those will be treated in the bylaw as well. So through this first draft of the comprehensive zoning bylaw, a general structure has been proposed for the entire city. However, only those regulations which are general and those which pertain to these 4 areas specifically are being brought forward at this time. And so those are the areas which are shown in green on the list on the presentation there. And noting that the overall structure is subject to change, and there are placeholders within the document for the items on here, which are shown in black, that are to come at a later date. So upfront sections of the draft comprehensive zoning bylaw address things like administration, so the purpose and the intent of the bylaw, compliance with the bylaw and enforcement, interpretation, as well as lists out the zones and the zone categories. It also includes regulations which are applicable to all zones, and this includes general regulations related to things like holding provisions, temporary construction and sales uses, non-complying lots, building structures, and lot conditions, as well as non-conforming uses. Further division of lots or blocks, common element condominiums, municipal services, public authority uses, accessory building and structure requirements that relate to all of the various different zones, and then projection regulations for all zones. The comprehensive zoning bylaw also proposes permitted uses for the zones within these areas. So a permitted uses chart is proposed in the draft zoning bylaw, outlining which uses will be permitted in each zone category. And so it's important to note that the list of permitted uses will differ across the different zone categories. And a series of 2 or 3 different zone categories are proposed in each of the areas, and these are differentiated to implement the official plan policies. Permitted uses in the zoning bylaw must align with the city's official plan policies for these areas as well. And some permitted uses also have associated conditions. And so just to give you an idea of the difference between the zones are generally things like limiting gross floor area, as well as the range of non-residential uses adjacent to neighborhoods, for example, establishing as directed through built form things like height, density, angular plane regulations, which provide appropriate transitions as well. And then the permitted uses also allow for a greater mix of uses as of right to create a more walkable and transit supportive communities along the Yonge Street corridor as well. And that includes a variety of housing types and those which support aging in place as well. So including things like assisted living, medical offices, smaller sized dwellings, as well. So I'm just going to give you a rundown of the different zone categories in each of the areas. So within the Village Local Center, there are 2 zone categories proposed, with the first pertaining to the lands which directly front onto Yonge Street, and then the second zone pertaining to the lands which don't directly front onto Yonge Street. For Oak Ridge's local center, there are also 2 different zone categories proposed, with, again, the first zone category pertaining to mostly those lands which are fronting along Yonge Street. And then the second zone category relates to some of the lands you'll see in the south end of the area that are not immediately adjacent to the corridor, and those which are in the furthest south area of the corridor. The Newkirk Local Center has 3 different zone categories proposed. So the first being in the northeast quadrant, the second being in the southeast, and then the third zone category, which is to the west of the rail corridor in that area. And then the Yonge and Carville 16th Avenue Key Development Area has 2 different proposed zone categories, and these again with the first fronting on Yonge and the second zone category capturing the lands which are further away from Yonge Street too. So in accordance with the recommendations of the strategic directions reports, the comprehensive zoning bylaw will also consider provisions with respect to both lot and building standards. So lot standards are proposed to address elements such as, things like maximum lot coverage, minimum soft landscaping, which is something that we heard through our consultation that was desired, minimum setbacks as well, lot frontage, minimum lot area. And then from a building standards perspective, building standards are proposed to address elements including height limits, density, tower separation, base building heights, ground floor heights, amenity space requirements, and tower floor plates. And it's important to note that these standards will vary in some cases by zone category, and also that these regulations and standards will continue to be reviewed and refined as the drafting of the zoning bylaw progresses based on feedback from the public as well as agencies. And then Section 15 of the draft comprehensive zoning bylaw provides suggested regulations that are proposed to apply to specific uses such as short-term accommodations, home occupations, outdoor patios, and live-work units. So where the permitted use chart allows for these types of uses, they are also subject to the specific use regulations contained in this section of the bylaw. The bylaw also includes a section related to regulations on automobile parking, bicycle parking, transportation demand management, and loading regulations. And the proposed transportation-related regulations are based on the city's parking and transportation demand management strategy for developments, which was prepared by HDR, and that is also available on the Zone Richmond Hill website under the Strategic Directions Report number 4. Is where people can find those. And this includes things like automobile parking space rates by different parking strategy area across the city for just these 4 areas, parking space dimensions, accessible parking space requirements, bicycle parking rates and regulations, transportation demand management regulations are also proposed, and then loading space rates, electric vehicle and e-bike minimum requirements. Definitions are also proposed to be included within the bylaw, and these are bolded to clearly articulate various components within the regulations. So the slide shows just a few examples of the different types of definitions that are contained within the draft bylaw that are actually defined terms. And certain definitions may also have accompanying illustrations in the final draft, which is brought forward for approval. And then as part of Phase 1A of the comprehensive zoning bylaw, a series of draft maps were prepared for the 4 intensification areas. And these include a zoning map. So the images that I showed earlier on in the presentation were images of the zoning maps for the areas, density overlay, height overlay, parking areas overlay, natural features overlay, as well as high aquifer vulnerability and wellhead protection area overlays, identifying, in the case of the last couple, where different features might exist, and then additional regulations that would apply in those areas. And then the following schedules also remain under consideration. So one of them being a schedule related to angular planes, and the other being that related to site-specific zoning exceptions as well. And these are just some examples of the draft maps showing things like density. So you'll see a range of density there expressed in floor space index. And then on the right-hand side is an example of a height schedule, both being for Newkirk Local Center, showing a range of permitted heights. And then next steps. So the purpose of the staff report and the presentation tonight is to receive comments from council and the public with respect to the first draft of Phase 1A of the comprehensive zoning bylaw. Certain aspects of the official plan, which remain under consideration, include but is not limited to the minimum percentage of units in high-density residential development containing 3 or more bedrooms, regulations to address proximity of residential uses within Newkirk Local Center to existing employment uses, regulations specific to the Hillcrest Mall site with respect to retention of gross leasable floor area, facilities related to planned transit services in the Yonge and Carville 16th Key Development Area, the interface of non-residential with residential uses in the Village Local Center. And then, as I mentioned, there are certain technical matters which are also still under consideration, including how best to convey angular plane requirements and how to present site-specific exceptions. There will also be inclusion of transition regulations to govern the transition from the current zoning structure to the comprehensive zoning bylaw as well. So Any general comments or questions can be directed to staff, to the Manager of Development, Zoning, and Committee of Adjustment. And so the contact information is provided there on the slide. Contact information is also provided on the Zone Richmond Hill website. Any site-specific questions or comments are encouraged and should also be directed to staff. Staff and the city's consulting team will review, consider, and incorporate feedback as appropriate, and we will report back on the feedback that we do receive as well and how that's been addressed in future versions of the bylaw that come forward. And then we expect to finalize phase 1A of the comprehensive zoning bylaw and then present it at a future committee of the whole meeting for consideration and approval, or for another council public meeting as deemed appropriate or as required under the Planning Act. So we are looking forward to public input and further discussion with staff and with agencies as well. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Actually, before you finish, could I just ask you to briefly give everybody that's listening an outline of what is the relationship between an official plan and a zoning bylaw? Because I think I want that to happen, because with the comments that we're going to be making here tonight, I want to make sure that we're focusing on the zoning bylaw that kind of sits on top of the official plan, but you're going to say it better than I can. So it would be great if you could do that.
Sure. Absolutely. So the city's official plan policies actually guide what goes into the zoning bylaw, and the zoning bylaw presents regulations. So whereas the policies are broader and maybe not as prescriptive, the zoning bylaw, which implements the policies, can actually be a bit more prescriptive. It has to be in conformity with the official plan policies, but it can provide more detailed direction. For example, the official plan may allow for a broad range of uses in a particular land use designation. And through the zoning bylaw, as you saw with the zoning map and the different zone categories, you can actually provide more prescriptive, which uses within that area are most appropriate in, this location versus that location based on the site-specific conditions as well of those areas. And so that's like the real differentiator, I would say, between the official plan and the zoning bylaw of the city.
Okay. I think that's good. So if we can just kind of keep that in mind as we're going forward. I mean, that the heights and the densities that are already in the official plan are not really the discussion for tonight. It's the details of implementing the heights and the densities. It's not the building permissions that are already there.
Yeah, so the framework is there, the broad land use framework that's been approved, that's been consulted on publicly through the separate official plan update process. So that's providing us with the framework.
Okay.
And then we can, of course, we can still engage in some of those nuanced discussions or questions. And of course, we can say whether and how certain issues may or may not be able to be addressed through the zoning bylaw, but there are also other tools. I'm thinking back to some of the discussions we had previously around things like short-term rentals, around municipal licensing, or other tools that the city can use outside of what maybe the zoning bylaw can allow for.
Right. Okay. All right. Well, at this point in time, I don't think we have anybody registered electronically to delegate. We'll bring this back to the audience. Is there anybody in the audience that would like to speak on this matter? Come on up, sir. This is, you've got 5 minutes to address council. If you can just say your name and address, that would be great.
Hello, my name's Charlotte Petkovic. I live at 85 Worthington Avenue, and I'm just here to kind of give I have a couple of brief, more procedural questions about the zoning bylaw. The first is specific to Oak Ridges, where I live. I was reading through the bylaw draft. I noticed that the zoning permissions for the Oak Ridge Local Center don't permit secondary schools, including on the land where the current Betty Stevenson school is and where the Oak Ridges Secondary School is going to be created or built. I just wanted to clarify if that's going to have if that not being in the zoning bylaw is going to impact or frustrate that.
Interesting. Okay. This is not really a back and forth time, but I'm having a feeling that the Ward 1 councillor will probably ask that question when it's her turn to speak. So you had some other things as well?
Yes.
Okay.
The second question is more general about and I was also reading through the policies on outdoor patios, and I wasn't sure if they're allowed to encroach in the front yards that are required. I'm not really in a position to be personally affected by either of these, but I think just from shaping the kind of community I want to live in, that I want to see as someone who lives in Oak Ridges, those are kind of things I'm curious about having, and whether the zoning bylaw is going to do those things or can do those things.
Okay.
All
That's
right.
great.
Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Anybody else? Okay. Seeing none. So we'll bring this back to council. I guess we'll need a motion to refer all comments back to staff. So who would like to get us kicked off and started? So Councillor Silovitz.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and my thanks to staff for this commendable staff report, and to our consultants as well for all your work. Greatly appreciated. I am pretty much okay with everything that has been stated and everything that I've read. I just wanted one clarification through you, Mr. Chair. On your page that says maps and schedules, sorry, there's no numbers. Could you clarify for me what overlay means?
Good.
Thank you.
Perfect. So through the chair, there are certain portions of the bylaws, certain maps, which are operative and non-operative parts of the bylaw. And so the overlays don't necessarily require a change to the bylaw itself to interpret their implementation for those schedules, which are shown as overlays versus the zoning map itself. Both apply and both have associated regulations that relate between them, and then between the written text of the bylaw itself.
Thank you. And through you, Mr. Chair, are there any that are exempt? For example, natural features and high aquifer vulnerability and wellhead protection? Are any of them exempt to an overlay, or is it always shown or always used?
Through the chair. So certain areas of the city have these potentially features that exist or constraints, or the mapping sometimes comes from, for example, provincial government or the conservation authorities regulated area. And so some areas may have items shown on the overlay as applying, and other areas, the overlay schedule itself might exist, but there would be no features or no areas identified within that area. So with a zoning bylaw, when interpreting it, planners have to read the zoning bylaw in its entirety as well, just to see whether something applies or doesn't apply to an area.
Thank you. I appreciate that. That's really all, Mr. Chair. Again, thank you very much. I am extremely grateful for all the work that has been put in here, and that we're finally going to see something come to us that's going to be real. So thank you so much.
Okay, thank you. And Councillor Tree, you'll move, second the motion? And go ahead.
Okay, thank you so much for coming here and give us this draft. I know it's a comprehensive bylaw. It's so complicated. So I read the bylaw, the contents. Looks like this 1A phase, we have around 12 different bylaw previous from either city or town or king or other pieces. So there are 12 of them. Just from a knowledge perspective or information perspective, in the following different phases, how many other bylaws we're going to look after? Similar like this one. This 1A, we have 12 different bylaws. For the remaining 1B and also phase 2, how many other bylaws will be in scope? Do you have any high levels?
Through the chair, I think I'm going to defer to staff here on this one.
Through the chair to Councillor Tree. So the city has approximately 44 parent bylaws. So the comprehensive zoning bylaws is an attempt to consolidate those 44 bylaws into one. So as part of this phase, it only deals with 12. And as we move forward, the remaining 28 or thereabouts will be consolidated and the subsequent phases of the comprehensive zoning bylaw moving forward.
Okay, thank you so much. So my next question regarding to the OPAs, I think this purpose is OPA oriented or targeted. From my research, we have 3 OPA now is on the Ontario Land Tribunal's hand. OPA 18.5, which is Young Carville 16, 18.6 Village Local Center, 18.8 Oak Ridge Local Center. If there are some kind of decisions made by the OLT, does that result will impact our bylaws now or not? Through you to through Mayor to our consultant.
Through the chair to Councillor Tree. So yes, so the OPAs that this zoning bylaw attempts to implement are in different stages of approvals. Hopefully so the goal is in accordance with our half initiative agreements is to have this bylaw approved by the end of March. We'll have some more clarity with respect to the status of the appeals as it relates to the OPAs that you identified. Currently, only one of the OPAs is in full force and effect, which is the Newkirk Local Center. So it's hoped that if there are settlements, if the appeals are scoped, that we are able to bring forward the comprehensive zoning bylaw as it applies to those areas that are in full force and effect. So we have some work to do and we have some time, and hopefully the time will allow for some clarity with respect to the appeals that this bylaw applies.
Okay, thank you. My next question regarding to one specific topic about the electricity car or e-bikes. I see the charts. So there are 2 level chart, level 1 and level 2. I'm short of, sorry, I'm short of my knowledge. What is that level 1 and level 2 chart? I forgot which page. So if you search for, I think it's 18 pounds something. Let me just get it. I think 16.5. If you can look at 16.5 page is just give me a second. It's on the page 67. So there are charging level, level 1, level 2, even higher. So I'm just curiosity. It's on the page 68, 67. So if there's any violation, maybe it's too technical, just questioning how much money going to charge for those level 1, level 2, and even higher, $1,000 or $50? Anyone knows it?
Through the chair. I don't know the monetary rate of the charging. I believe the level 1 and level 2 charging infrastructure refers to the speed of the charging for those 2 different levels. And it's really speaking to just a requirement of when the developer were to put a charger or charging infrastructure in a parking lot, for example, that they'd have certain requirements to provide a level 2, so a faster, charging time charger, or a level 1, which is a slower slower speed charging, but then things like rates, and this goes back to Mayor West's, I guess, comment about, what is the scope of the bylaw and what's outside the scope of the bylaw. And so then any sort of private agreements with those providers for charging infrastructure, their prices would be separate from something that zoning could regulate.
Okay, perfect. I'll reserve my last question. I think that gentleman mentioned the patio. I do have curiosities here because in my World War IV and also World War II, we do have a business BIA areas and a lot of business owners in summer. They do have that patio requirement, extend their business to the Yonge Street. So in the future, we might have more business along Yonge Street down the Highway 7 or north to the Oak Ridge. So my curiosity is here. Do you have any more information about that patio requirement for our local business owners? Thank you.
Great, through the chair. So the patio provisions that are included in this particular bylaw mirror those which are in the city's bylaw for 11117, which I believe is the Yonge and Bernard key development area as well. But if there are specific concerns from business owners related to whether those regulations are serving them or not in their business operations, then I think that's definitely something that we'd welcome any commentary on. I'll have to look into further detail on the comment that was raised earlier on outdoor patios and permissions for front yards or projections, that sort of thing, to get a more specific response on that. But that's something that we can work with staff to get that response on.
Okay, thank you so much. I'm going to throw in my last question because all the bylaws are living changes because these are different business. This is a pilot. This we put together, we practice in case of some kind of adjustments required. Assuming there's going to be a living documentations on bylaw documentation. So what is that life cycles? We're going to 2 years, 3 years, whatever time we review it. Is there anything can make make sense? Because no one knows if those things put into production might have a negative feedback, then we have to make a judgment, right? So from the review or auditing or adjustment perspective, how are we going to handle that type of the result coming back to us? Thank you.
Sure. Through the chair, I can speak to currently the draft comprehensive zoning bylaw, which is on the website. That is very much a living and evolving document. So we will be making adjustments in the short term, as was mentioned by staff, up until its approval, to be able to address any sort of feedback that we receive on the appropriateness of those regulations or gaps and whatnot. And then after that point, I would defer to staff as far as a regular sort of routine update. Some municipalities do general housekeeping amendments to their bylaws, every 1 year, every 3 years, to your point as well. So I don't know if staff has anything further to add to that.
Through the chair to Councillor Tree. So at this stage, once the bylaw is approved, there's not necessarily a time frame for a regular review. Council can direct staff to take a look at specific standards or regulations that warrant a review, and then we can make the appropriate zoning bylaw amendments accordingly. Similarly, when we have an OP update exercise, that can sometimes prompt a review of the zoning bylaw to ensure that the OP and zoning bylaw do comply with one another. So those are the opportunities. And then there's also the opportunities of private applications to the city for zoning bylaw amendment.
Got it. Thank you so much. I don't have further questions.
Okay, thank you. Councillor Davidson.
Thank you, through you, Mr. Chair. Thank you for the presentation and thank you for staff. Following up on a resident question. So I had not heard that secondary schools are not allowed in local centers. Can I ask staff or you for a response to that, please?
Sure. I guess staff will take that one.
Through the chair to Councillor Davidson. So the official plan currently has locational criteria. for schools. So that's why they're not necessarily permitted as of right, per se, because there is locational criteria that have to be met. Notwithstanding that, the existing schools that do exist, for example, the one that was referred to, will be acknowledged. We just haven't kind of determined what the manner in which we will be acknowledging existing uses that currently exist today, that may or may not necessarily meet the criteria, the locational criteria that's contained within our official plan.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. So to clarify, if there's already a school there, the chances are, well, 100%, that's another school can, even if it changes to a different type of school, it's already there, it's approved, it's grandfathered. Okay, thank you. And the other question about patios in the front, I have a question about that, but I don't know if it'll address the residents' concern. But my question was, are we closing the loophole where we have interlocking brick as a accent to a garden and it ends up being paving over an entire front lawn so people put 5 cars there? Are we closing that loophole somehow so that decorative pavers can't be used to completely pave over an entire front lawn?
Through the chair. This is something that we've heard, I think, repeatedly through all of our various consultations around this concern. So I mentioned in the presentation, we are differentiating between hard landscaping and soft landscaping requirements as well to try to close that loophole. And I think, as mentioned at a previous meeting, it may not address sort of existing non-conforming situations, but it will be enforceable, for future situations down the line. It's more of a matter that will pertain and will investigate in further detail as well when we get to the neighborhood areas of the city, as well as these are the intensification areas have less sort of landscaped front yards that are parked on with private automobiles. So,
Okay, thank you. Through you, Mr. Chair. I don't know if you can pull up a slide, but the one of the local center in Oak Ridges. And I've brought this up before and it keeps showing up. And my understanding is that at the moment, the local center goes from, I don't know if you call up that slide, but basically it goes from Old Colony to King, along King to Parker, and then from King up to Worthington where there's a beer store. So it's young, but your maps continually show at the very top, this local center going from Worthington all the way up to Bloomington. And on the right-hand side, I've said this before, that is Oak Ridges Moraine. And while I know it's not protected, it's not part of the part that's protected, it's also, you're permitted to build there. At the moment, my understanding is it's 4 stories. I honestly think things have changed enough since the Oak Ridges Marine Plan in 25 years that we need to reconsider zoning that for intensification of any kind, business or not. Because if you make it local center, my understanding is the height densities go from 4 to 8 stories. That is river, water, though, because not so much because we necessarily don't want people to live there, but because that is a huge area that's extremely wet and going to be continually be wet moving forward. And with climate change, we have to stop saying we're going to intensify on extremely sensitive areas. So that I've brought this up more than once, and if it was up to me, I would say the local center needs to end at Worthington. Not that we can't build more, we'll go with the 4 stories, but that we shouldn't build more. And frankly, north of Bloomington, which is Aurora, they're huge estate homes on massive lots. Like, this will not match the rest of Yonge Street from Bloomington all the way up to maybe Wellington. So if it was up to me, I would stop the local center at Worthington and keep the rest as residential. That's not to say you can't have a little 4-story something with a little shop in the bottom, or we can't have business there. But right now, there's no businesses. There's nothing. It is nature. So that's more a statement than a question, but I'll keep fighting for it. So thank you.
Thank you very much. Councillor Thompson.
Thank you very much. And actually, you're probably close to the slide that I'd like you to pull up as well. And that's for the proposed zones for the village core. You showed an LC V1, and you were, if I'm not mistaken, you were indicating about properties that face Young Street. But when you look at LC V1, this also includes properties, if I'm not mistaken here. Well, maybe I am mistaken. Okay. So when you look at the ones that are LCV2, those are all on Church Street predominantly, if you're looking on the east side. And we've been having problems on the transition side. And so I recognize that the report, 1.15 says right now transition matters are intentionally left blank. And of course, I want to ask questions about transition. So typically when we talk transition, we're talking about compatible built forms. That's typically what we're talking about, and how they will relate with adjacent areas. Where I'm more concerned is when you're putting a business next to a neighborhood low density property. So I've got situations in this very area that we're talking about where you have existing low density neighborhood homes that are next to a sports bar, basically. And I get it if we were talking about, if the property was on Yonge Street, because if you're abutting that property, you're looking at 200 feet deep lots. But when you're right on Church Street and you've got a property that's now been, approved to have a commercial activity, you could be 6 feet away, because that's what the side yard, it could be. So I guess what I'm looking at is I want to make sure that when we're talking about transition, that we're also talking about transition zones that would talk about the various permitted uses commercially, so that you're not looking at something that's open until 2 o'clock in the morning, something that is really not, in line with those types of properties that are right there, that have to live it every day. So will we be looking at, under the specific use regulations, will that be something that we will actually be looking at where, and I don't know what you want to call them, transition zones or something like that, but will that be what we'll be looking at?
Great. Through the chair to Councillor Thompson. So absolutely, this is something that we continue to look at through the bylaw. We continue to welcome comments such as your own around which types of uses in particular are not compatible. And with if you look at the zone, the LCV2 and the LCV1, I think the zone that we're largely talking about here is the LCV2 and what types of both uses should be permitted in those areas, what types of built form or buffering requirements need to be provided in those areas. You did mention the specific use provisions. And so specifically, for example, for patios, there is a restriction around properties which are adjacent to a neighborhood zone, and some restrictions around patios in those cases. There are definitely things that we can further explore through conversations with yourself or other residents or business owners within the village local center as well, to tighten that up and make sure that the right types of uses are permitted adjacent to the residential uses.
No, and I appreciate that. And believe me, I recognize that the area is in transition. It's going to happen. But while there are still low density, homes abutting, side by side to these businesses, I really think that we need to ensure that we have something similar to what we do with compatible built forms, where you have angular planes and things like that, we got to be talking about, well, you can only have hours of operation between this and that and things like that. Those are the types of things that I think we really have to incorporate, at least while those are still in place. Now, if that property gets sold, that low density neighborhood property gets sold and it gets bought by a business, well, then that one that's isn't abutting the neighborhood property anymore, it can fall under the other regulation as far as I'm concerned. So those are my comments. Thank you.
Okay. All right. I don't see anybody else that wants to speak at this point. Oh, there we go. Virtual hand from Regional Local Councillor Chan.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Mayor, for recognizing me. I thought I raised my virtual hand just at the right moment. Thank you very much for staff and the consultant for the presentation and staff report. I know this has been not just been done yesterday, as outlined early on. It has been a process that follow. And thank you for the gentleman who in the chamber raised the question. I just want to get back to one slide. I think is have the title or subheading called specific use regulation. Would you mind to display that particular slide again? I think I see about at least 4 different topics. Right. Okay. Bang on. Thank you. It is 4 items there. And if maybe I work from bottom up, live work units. In some way, that would mean I'm thinking about the distinction between that number 4 bullet and number 2, home occupations. So through Mr. Chair, perhaps the consultant help me to elaborate. If you can elaborate a little bit. I think live work units, meaning you can have home occupation. On the other hand, if you are in a residential neighborhood but want to run a business at home, I guess the criteria may be somewhat different. Is it correct? Through Mr. Chair.
Through the chair to Councillor Chan. So you are correct. There is a distinction between live work and home occupations. And so both are defined terms in the bylaw. And so they have separate definitions that the reader can look at as well. Live work units refer to a purpose-built, it's like a type of development product where there is a storefront in the bottom of the unit and a connected residential accommodation, often above that unit itself as well. Not necessarily like it wouldn't be in the sense of like ground floor separate commercial units and separate apartments above it. These are truly like integrated units where the owner can do a little bit more than what they could otherwise do as a home occupation. So home occupations are typically your home-based business. They can be in neighborhood areas. They may be run out of a condo building or apartment unit as well. And they don't have like customer facing or storefront aspects to them. Whereas live work units do have a bit more of a customer facing component where customers can come in, there can be signage and all of that sort of thing. And so the specific use regulations for the live work units really are directed to that type of a development product and prescribes a number of different regulations for those uses. And then home occupations, again, tries to address compatibility with predominantly residential uses that would be surrounding these home occupation uses.
Thank you for the answer. And now among the 4 categories there, and my colleagues have already asked and talked about the outdoor patio. I'm not going to touch on that one. It goes to the remaining one, the top one. Actually, something that I feel very strongly about, something the city has to do in terms of regulating short-term accommodation. So if I understand it correctly, this is going to be in a specifically zone-specific kind of area. Certain kind of criteria or limitation, restriction that would be articulated and spelled out in the future bylaw. So I'm just trying to get a sense that this is direction that is proposing. Is it correct? In terms of regulating or limiting or whatever the right term is for the short-term accommodation in the city of Richmond Hill, through Mr. Chair. To the consultant.
Great.
Or
Through the
staff.
chair, through the chair, in response on the short-term accommodations. So regulations have been included under the specific use section around short-term accommodations, and some of those are in response to what we heard in previous consultations and as well as previously from council as well, to try to restrict those as far as them being the principal residence of the operator of those types of units. As far as sort of locational restrictions, that's not something that's been investigated or proposed through this particular draft. So where under permitted uses, short-term rental accommodations would be permitted, they would be subject to, of course, the specific use regulations, but would be allowed. So if there are particular comments around appropriateness of locating some of those, it's something that we could continue to have further discussions on. And I think further discussions have been happening with among staff around things like licensing as well, that may be different or better tools that could address some of those types of concerns.
Thank you. Better tools. Interesting you mentioned that. So moving beyond that, and we see 4 categories there. What about other categories? I'm thinking about my colleagues and also the delegate asked about the public school. What about potentially private school? Would that be constitute as another specific use category through you, Mr. Chair?
Great. Through the chair, in response around the schools matter, I think staff mentioned before there are certain uses that have specific policies in the official plan that haven't been permitted as of right through this version of the zoning bylaw. If there are particular regulations with regard to private schools or other of those types of uses, then that's something that we can definitely explore with staff. Again, looking at the official plan policies as well, and the official plan review, and when, if and when there may be adjustments to those policies around community uses, including things like private schools as well for inclusion.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Now, just want to be absolutely clear. So you mentioned about, of course, the official plan and the zoning standards are set out in the end, but I gather it does not preclude someone coming with a proposal, seeking amendment to the OP and seeking amendment in the future comprehensive bylaw. Would that, I see it nodding, so maybe the answer is already there. Just to, through Mr. Chair, maybe to hear, absolutely, is that the case, correct? Meaning one can always make application seeking amendment through Mr. Chair.
Through the chair, that is correct. So anyone does have the right, private developer does have the right to request an amendment to both the city's official plan or the, right now it would be the current bylaw that's in place as well to have changes considered for their particular lands.
Thank you. Thank you very much. And thank you, Mr. Mayor, for allowing me to seek those clarification, ask questions. Thank you.
Okay, anybody else? Okay, seeing none. So it's been a good conversation. I thank you very much. I will say that this is really important, and it's important for a number of reasons. But one of them, I think, that stands out in my mind, in my experience on this council for the last number of years, is that our zoning bylaws right now in so many parts of the city are very, very, very out of date. I would call them antiques. You know, I'll miss bylaw 6671 when it's gone. But I think, you know, the problem with a bylaw like that, and some of the bylaws that aren't even Richmond Hill bylaws that we have, is that they were created such a long time ago that they don't reflect in any way, shape, or form modern standards and modern things that people are thinking about when they're proposing a use and or a built form on that property. So in areas like that, almost nothing that is proposed, whether it's reasonable or whether it's not reasonable, conforms with the bylaw. And that's really not fair to the applicant. It's not fair to the people that live there, that have an expectation. If it's the expectation of a bylaw that's like 50 years ago, it's really not a realistic expectation. So I think this exercise, when we're finished, will correct that problem to a very large degree. And, you know, and I think it will ultimately, what we want is to have a zoning bylaw that's reflective of kind of a more modern standard. And I think, you know, Councillor Thompson and a couple of others made the comment too, that, you know, one of the main features of a zoning bylaw is to keep away things that don't belong close together. And, you know, again, getting back to that modern standard, I think we need to be looking at a more modern version of trying to accomplish that goal. So I don't really have any specific questions about the zoning bylaw in particular, but I do appreciate the work that's gone into this. And I do appreciate the work that has gone into this in getting the public's feedback. And I've heard you reference that a couple of times in this presentation, because it really is important to make sure that we're reflecting what people are looking for in their community as well. So that being said, you want a second round? Okay. Go ahead.
Great, thank you, Mr. Chair. So I only have one question, follow up our Deputy Mayor's question regarding to the short-term care or Airbnb. I think Mayor has that. We're being bugged by the residents, one of the specific locations. So we define the Airbnb or short-term because the primary residents must be sitting or living in the same dormitory. But from the bylaw perspective, you even have a definition here, but what's the action plan will be applied for if someone violates that bylaw? What's going to be the output? Is there going to be money penalties or yeah, that's my question.
Ms. Gianetta, do you want to take a shot at that?
So currently, the permissions will be established through the comprehensive zoning bylaw, and that can be dealt with if there's an infraction with respect to the zoning bylaw. That can be dealt with our staff currently through bylaw enforcement. If the city chooses to do further regulations and licensing requirements related to short-term rental, that will come forward as part of another exercise, and then there will be enforcement related to the licensing and regulations under that program. So for the purposes of the comprehensive zoning bylaw, if they don't comply with the zoning permissions that we are establishing as part of the comprehensive zoning bylaw, that will be in a bylaw enforcement matter. But it's going to be only limited to what's contained within the bylaw, which is establishing the use and whether or not the person is actually living in the unit and renting out the space.
Okay, in case someone did not apply for permit or for the this bylaw, because they do it secretly, it's just no one knows it, and until someone reported. In this case, so for the future, if someone secretly, privately sharing their dwelling units for business for the short term, so they are violating the bylaw. If there are any reporting or complaints from residents, so we can still using the same process to regulate them, right? I just want to confirm that. Thank you so much. I'm waiting for more actions because I think definition is good things, but we need some action plan. If dollar can be put in the table, maybe someone going to be consider. Thank you.
Okay, anybody else? Okay, I mean, I'll just add to that. I mean, I think that staff is definitely moving in the right direction with regard to short-term rentals, right? And Councillor Tree, you and I have had a couple of conversations about one particularly problematic location in your ward. But I think that it's very important that people consider the fact that under this new approach, you have to have that as your primary residence. So if somebody's having a wild party in your house, you're suffering exactly the same as the rest of the community is suffering because you live there too. So I think that'll go a long way in helping to address that. And I think the way the approach that I understand it is that, on top of that, we can layer another layer, which is the licensing. Now that will have a cost to the community. And I mean, if it's necessary, we'll do it. If it's not necessary, then we won't. But I think that you'll find that this approach will probably go a long way to solving most of the problems that we might encounter with short-term rentals. So, okay, with that being said, I think we have a motion on the floor to refer all comments back to staff. All those in favor? Opposed? That carries unanimously. Thank you very much. And the last item on the agenda is a motion to adjourn. Councillor Silovitz, Councillor Davidson, all those in favor? Opposed? That carries unanimously.